Alice Renshaw sat at the card table with a needle in her hand, and the Baroness said it loud enough for the whole room to turn. Alice did not lift her eyes. She was a widow, 52 years old, a sewing woman at Aldercott Hall in Cheshire, taken on for £14 a year and a bed above the stillroom. She had mended half the aprons in that house without being asked, and on a cold night in the card season, over the deal, with 11 guests watching the cards fall, the mistress of the house looked at the quiet woman by the fire and made her a thief in front of them all. There were no tears. Alice kept her needle moving, in and out of the linen, small and even, the way her hands had moved for 40 years. That was the only answer she gave, and then the Baroness said the line that would be repeated all winter as a parlour joke. She said, "Count the spoons when she leaves." 11 people heard it. 11 people laughed. A widow with no family to write to, no husband to stand for her, no name in that county but the one she carried in on her own 2 feet, and now that name had a mark on it that no denial could ever scrub off. You cannot prove you did not take a spoon, you can only be watched. So the next morning Alice did the one thing no one expected. She went to the mistress, and she asked to be searched, every night. At the servant's door as she left, and she asked that each search be written down in a book, and signed. They thought it a punishment. They gave it to her, smiling, as a penance for the whole house to enjoy. What none of them understood, not the Baroness, not her son, not the butler who signed the first line, was this. Alice Renshaw had just opened the only account in England that could save her. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one find you, take a second and subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I like to know who's out there in the quiet, listening. Now, back to Aldercott. Alice had come to that house 6 months a widow. Her husband had been a clockmaker in Chester, a small man with warm hands and a shop that smelled of oil and brass. He mended the parish clock for nothing. He died in the spring, quick, a fever that took him inside a week, and left her with a shop full of tools and no way to keep it. There were debts. There is always the burial. She sold his lathe and his files and his little drawers of springs to the man 2 doors down, and the money went into the ground with him. She had no children living. She had a brother once, gone to sea, gone for good. She had no one to write to. That is a plain thing to say and a heavy thing to be. When you are alone in the world, your name is the only property you own outright. Alice knew that better than most. She had watched people be careless with theirs. She had never been careless with hers. The place at Aldercott came through the vicar. A great house always wants a woman who can sew. £14 a year, her keep, and a narrow bed in a narrow room over the stillroom where the sugar and the preserves were kept, so that her sheets smelled faintly of cloves all winter. She took it and was grateful. Grateful is what you learn to be. She kept one thing back from the sale, one thing only. Her husband's brass thimble. He had turned it himself on his own lathe, years before, a joke between them, because she was always losing hers. It sat heavier than a thimble ought to. It had a little band around the base where he had cut her initials, so small you needed the light. She kept it in her sewing box, and she used it every day. It was the one clean thing she owned. It was, if you like, her whole estate. At Aldercott she made herself useful past her wages. She mended the maids' aprons in the evenings, unasked, because a torn apron cost a girl a scolding, and the girls had little enough. She turned collars. She darned the good tablecloths so the darns did not show. She was quiet. She listened more than she spoke. She learned the house the way a careful woman learns anything, slowly and without letting on that she was learning it. She learned, for instance, where the good plate lived. The silver, the real silver, the salvers and the casters, and the great christening cup lived in the plate room off the butler's pantry, behind 2 locks. Mist, Pargiter, the butler, held one key. The mistress held the other. There was an inventory, an old book, listing every piece by name and weight, and it was Mr. Pargiter's business to read that list against the shelves and make sure nothing had walked. That was the rule. That was his duty. Mr. Pargiter had not read the inventory against the shelves in 4 years. Nobody's business but his. He was getting old, and the count was tedious, and nothing had ever gone missing that he'd heard of, so why trouble himself? He signed the book at the year's end from memory, and the plate room stayed locked, and everyone slept easy. Remember that. 4 years, 2 locks, and a list nobody had checked. That is the door in this story, and it was standing open the whole time. The trouble began, as trouble in great houses often does, with a small thing. A silver bodkin went missing from the mistress's own sewing box, a little thing for threading ribbon, no bigger than a hairpin, worth a few shillings at most. The Baroness kept it in a velvet slot, and one morning the slot was empty. Now, a bodkin can roll under a chair. A bodkin can catch in a fold of stuff and be carried to another room. A bodkin can be dropped in the garden and never seen again. But the Baroness did not look under the chair. She looked at Alice. She said nothing. She did not need to say anything. She simply let her eyes travel across the room and settle on the sewing woman, and let them rest there a moment longer than was kind, and then she looked away. And in that little house, where a look from the mistress carried further than a shout, that was enough. Alice felt it land. She had done nothing. She had not touched the bodkin, had not wanted it, would not have known where to sell such a thing if she had. But there is no defence against a look. You cannot answer a look. You cannot say, "I did not do the thing you have not accused me of." So she said nothing either, and she went on with her mending, and she told herself it would pass. That was her mistake, though she did not know it yet. She thought silence was safety. She would learn, before this was over, that silence is only safe when it is written down. A week after the bodkin, they searched her basket. It was the housekeeper who did it, Mrs. Dennett, a hard woman with cold hands, and she did it in the kitchen with the young undermaid, Susan Pell, standing right there. Susan was 16 and frightened of everything, and she went white to the lips watching it. Mrs. Dennett took Alice's work basket, her own basket, her threads and her scissors and her scraps of good stuff saved for patching, and she turned it out on the kitchen flags, right out, onto the cold stone, in front of the girl, so that the reels rolled and the pins scattered, and Alice had to kneel down on the flags in her good black dress to gather them. There was nothing in the basket. Of course there was nothing. There was never going to be anything. But the searching was the point, you see. The searching is what the house remembered. By supper it had gone round the servants' hall. They turned out Renshaw's basket, and it did not matter one bit that they had found nothing. What people carried away was the turning out, the kneeling on the flags. Where there is smoke, they think. They never stop to ask who lit it. Susan Pell came to her afterward, in the passage, twisting her apron. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Renshaw," she whispered. "I didn't know they were going to do that." Alice looked at the girl's frightened face, and something in her softened, because the child was too scared to say more, and Alice knew that kind of scared. "It's no matter, Susan," she said. "You did nothing." But it was matter. It was mattering more every day. And Alice, kneeling that night by her narrow bed with the smell of cloves in the sheets, understood that this was not going to stop on its own. She just did not yet see how large it would grow. It grew at the card table. It was February. The Baroness had guests for cards, as she did through the season, county people, a colonel, 2 clergymen and their wives, a widowed cousin, a young man from Manchester whom Julian had brought down. 11 of them, all told, at the tables in the long drawing-room, with the fire high and the candles lit, and Alice in the corner with her needle. because that was where she sat of an evening, mending, near enough the light. The cards went round. There was wine. There was that loud, easy laughter that comes off people who have never once in their lives had to kneel on a cold floor and gather their own pins. And in the middle of a deal, with the whole room warm and loose and listening, the Baroness looked across at the woman in the corner, and she said it. Clear, carrying, timed, so the deal would pause and every face would turn. "Count the spoons," she said when she leaves, and the room laughed. I want you to sit with that a moment, the way Alice had to sit with it. She was not accused of taking anything in particular. That was the cruelty of it. If she had been told, "You took the bodkin," she could have said, "I did not. Search my room, ask the girl. But you cannot answer, count the spoons. It is not a charge. It is a shape. It fits itself over you, and it stays." 11 people now carried it in their memory, and every one of them would tell it again, and there was no procedure in the world by which a widow could stand up and clear her name of a joke. Alice did not lift her eyes. Her needle went in and out of the linen, small and even, and did not so much as pause. She let the laughter wash over the top of her bowed head. She would not give them her face. She had learned that much in 52 years, that a still face is the last thing they cannot take from you. Inside, something had gone very cold and very clear. But her hands kept sewing. Anyone watching saw only a quiet woman at her work, and that was all she meant them to see. The winter made a game of it. That is the part that would have broken a softer person. The line did not die. It became a household toy. When a guest rose to leave, someone would murmur it, count the spoons, and there would be that little ripple of laughing again. The young man from Manchester said it. The Colonel said it. Even below stairs it travelled, said behind hands, said to needle Alice as she passed. Count the spoons. 3 little words, worn smooth as a river stone by handling, and every time they were said, they cut exactly as deep, because there was still nothing she could do about them. And here is where Alice Renshaw showed you what she was made of. A lesser woman would have raged, or wept, or given her notice, and walked out into a county that now knew her only as the sewing woman you counted the spoons for. Alice did none of that. She sat with it. She turned it over in the dark, night after night, the way her husband used to turn a stuck movement over in his fingers until he found the one wheel that fouled the rest. And she found it. She saw the thing exactly. The accusation could not be answered by denial. Fine. Then she would not deny it. She would do the opposite. If they wanted her watched, she would be watched so thoroughly, so completely, so tirelessly, that the watching itself became a record no one could argue with. If a look could hang her, then a signature could save her. She only had to make them sign. So she went to the mistress. It was a cold, clear morning, and the Baroness was at her writing desk, and Alice stood in the doorway, with her hands folded and her voice level, and asked her thing. She asked to be searched. Every night, she said. When she left the house by the servant's door to go up to her own bed, let her be stopped and searched, her basket and her pockets and her person, so that no one in the household need ever wonder again whether the sewing woman had carried anything out. And she asked one thing more, that each search be written in a book. The date, what was looked at, what was found, and a signature under it. The Baroness was delighted. You could see her delight. She thought Alice had broken, that the widow had come to grovel, to accept her penance in front of the whole house, to wear her shame like a collar. A nightly search, entered and signed, a public humiliation renewed every single evening. What better justice for a suspected thief who could not be caught? She granted it on the spot. She thought it was a punishment. She sent for the book herself. Mr. Pargeter signed the first line. He did it grudgingly, an old man made to stay by the door of an evening with a pen, But he did it. Searched, nothing found. A, R and the date, and his own name under it. He thought it beneath him. He did not once stop to think what a signed and dated line of his own hand might one day be worth. Or to whom. He was a man who had not counted the plate in 4 years. Counting was not, you understand, his strong point. And so the search book was born. A humiliation, they all thought, a stock for the whole house to throw at. Alice took the first entry up to her narrow room and sat on the edge of her bed and read it by the candle. Searched, nothing found. Dated, signed, she read it twice. Then she put the candle out. She was not humiliated. She was patient. She had opened a book, and a book, unlike a memory, does not laugh, and does not forget, and cannot be argued with in front of 11 guests. The nights began to stack up, every evening the same. Alice would finish her mending and take up her basket and go to the servants' door, and there would be someone there. Pargeter, or the housekeeper, or a footman set to it, and they would look through her basket and her pockets and pass their hands over her and turn to the book on its little shelf and write the line. Searched, nothing found. A, R, and sign. The first week the servants watched to enjoy it. The second week they were bored of it. By the fourth week it was as ordinary as locking the door, and the very people set to shame her had stopped even looking at her face while they did it. That is what habit does. Habit made them careless. Careless was exactly what Alice needed them to be. 11 weeks of it. 11 weeks of nothing found. A, R, clean, dated, signed, one line under another filling the book. And in those 11 weeks, mending her way through the passages of that house at all hours, quiet and unregarded, Alice began to notice something that made the cold, clear thing inside her go very still. The plate room was thinning. She could not have said it if she had not been in and out of every corridor at every hour, invisible with her basket. But she was, and she saw. She saw the door to the butler's pantry standing open one afternoon, and past it, the plate room door ajar, and a shelf where a great salver used to stand on its edge, catching the light, and the salver was not there. A week later, a set of casters, the pepper and the mustard and the rest, gone from their place. She knew that plate. She had dusted round it, she had seen it laid out for the big dinners, she knew the shape of a shelf with a thing on it, and the shape of a shelf without. And here is the moment the whole thing turned over in her hands, and she felt it turn. The silver was going missing from that house. Piece by piece, night after night, at the very same time that Alice Renshaw was being searched and found clean and signed for at the servants' door every single evening in a book. She could not be taking it. It was written down that she was not taking it. 11 weeks of a butler's own signature swore she was not taking it, and still it went. Do you see what she saw? She had asked to be searched as a punishment, and the punishment had, without anyone meaning it to, built her an alibi. Not for one night, for every night. A dated, witnessed, signed record that on the very evenings the plate walked out of that house, the woman they all suspected was standing at the door, with her basket turned out, and her pockets empty, and a butler's name under the proof of it. The humiliation was manufacturing her innocence. Every loss now carried, attached to it, a signed line that said, "Not her." The more the real thief took, the thicker grew the paper that cleared the woman they blamed. She had thought the book was a shield to hold in front of herself. She saw now it was something more. It was a weapon. And she had not even had to lift it, she had only had to obey. But a weapon points somewhere, and Alice, sitting up in her narrow room one night with the search book's meaning turning slowly in her mind, understood that being cleared was only half of it. The book proved it was not her. It did not yet prove who. Somebody was carrying that plate out. Somebody had the second key, or the use of it. Somebody was turning salvers and casters into money, and doing it steadily and counting, quite rightly, on the fact that Mr. Pargeter would not read his inventory this year any more than he had read it for the 4 years before. And the true question, the one that kept her awake with the smell of cloves in the dark, was this: silver does not vanish. Silver is not eaten. Silver goes somewhere and comes back, or it goes somewhere and is redeemed before anyone thinks to look. Somewhere in Chester or Manchester there was a shelf that was not this shelf, holding Aldercott's plate with a ticket on it and a name in a book. Another book. Another record. Waiting, Alice had a half-day coming to her. One half-day, once a fortnight, hers to do with as she pleased. She had always spent it walking or sitting in the churchyard where she could not afford yet to lay a stone. She knew now exactly how she would spend the next one. She would take the coach into Chester, and she would walk from one pawnbroker's window to the next, and she would look patiently the way she did everything until she found the shelf that matched the empty shelf at home. The half-day came on a raw grey morning at the end of the season. Alice put on her good black dress and her bonnet, and she tucked into her sewing box, beside her husband's brass thimble, a folded paper on which she had written. In her small, even hand, every piece she was sure had gone. The salver, the casters, and the dates. She had the dates because she had the book. She always now had the dates. She took the early coach. She sat with her hands folded over the box on her knee and watched the frozen fields go by and said nothing to the farmer's wife beside her. In Chester she got down by the cross and she began to walk. She knew the town. She had lived in it as a wife, in the little shop that smelled of oil and brass, and she knew its narrow streets and its trades, and she knew where a man went when he needed money quiet and quick and no questions. She walked past 3 pawnbrokers' windows and saw nothing she knew. Watches, a fiddle, a tray of rings that had come off living fingers. She walked on. The cold got into her feet. She did not hurry. Hurry was not a thing Alice did. And then, in a low window down a side street near the river, behind the dusty glass, standing up on its edge to catch what light there was, exactly the way it used to stand on its shelf at home, a great silver salver. Aldercott's salver. She knew the shape of it. She knew the chased border of it. She had dusted round that border 100 times. Alice Renshaw stood very still on the cold pavement outside Halloran's, with her husband's thimble in the box under her folded hands, and she looked at the stolen plate of the house that had told 11 people to count the spoons when she left. And she did not feel triumph. Not yet. What she felt was the door of the whole thing swinging quietly open in front of her, because she knew that inside that shop there would be a ticket, and a name in a book, and a date, and if the date matched a line in her book, a night when she stood searched and clean and signed for at the servant's door, then she had them. All of them, whoever's name was on that ticket. She put her hand on the latch of Halloran's door, and she went in to find out whose it was. The bell above the door was a small, apologetic thing. The shop smelled of tallow and damp wool, and something underneath that, old metal, old promises. A young man sat at the counter with a ledger open before him, and he looked up without interest, the way clerks look at women who come in alone on cold mornings and are not carrying anything worth his attention. Alice set her box on the counter and clasped her hands over it. She said she was inquiring about a piece, the salver in the window. She described it, the chased border, the central cartouche, the weight of it, in the plain exact way of a woman who had lifted such a thing repeatedly and knew its particulars without sentiment. She said she believed it might be a piece from a house where she was employed. The clerk's eyes sharpened a degree. He said pieces came in every day. He said he couldn't speak to every piece's history. He said this in the tone of a man who understood very well that history was precisely the question. Alice said she understood that. She said she was not there to cause difficulty. She said she wished only to look at the assay marks and the maker's mark if he would permit it, because if it was not the right piece she would say so, and leave him in peace. He brought it out, he set it on the counter between them and watched her hands as though she might bolt with it. She did not touch it. She leaned over it in the thin light from the window, and she read it, the Chester assay mark, the lion passant, the date letter, a lowercase italic H, which put it at 1849, 4 years back, and the maker's mark, a small cartouche with the initials RF, which was the firm that had supplied Aldercott's plate in the year the Baroness had remodelled the dining room. She had heard Mrs. Voss say so. She committed the date letter and the initials to the exact centre of her attention, the way she committed a stitch count, and then she straightened and said, very quietly, that she believed it was the right piece. The clerk closed his hand on the salver's rim. She said she had no intention of taking it. She said only that she wished to know, if he was willing to say, when it had come in. Under the Pawnbrokers Act, she said, carefully, the duplicate ticket would carry a date. A silence opened up between them in that low, cold shop. The clerk looked at her. She looked at the salver. Outside, someone drove a cart past the window, and the glass shivered in its frame. He opened a second ledger. He turned it 4 pages. He ran his finger down a column of entries and stopped, and she watched his face change slightly, the small, involuntary change of a man who has found something he was not expecting to find there. He looked up from the ledger. He did not want to tell her. She could see that. Alice waited. She had learned in 11 weeks how to stand still and let her silence do her work for her. "It's lodged under a name," he said at last. "I supposed it would be. I can't give out a customer's business." But his finger had not moved off the line, and his voice had gone thin. "You needn't give it," Alice said. "Only read it to yourself, and tell me whether it is a name that belongs to Aldercott Hall. I'll not ask more than that." He read it to himself. His mouth tightened. And then, because he was young, and because something in the thing offended him, he turned the ledger half around on the counter so the entry faced her. The Honourable J. Renmore, she looked at it a long moment. She had known. Since the shelf in the plate room first showed its gap, she had half known, the way you know a stitch has slipped 3 rows before you find it. But knowing a thing in the dark of your own head and reading it in another man's ledger, in a stranger's ink, are 2 different weights. "He comes himself?" she asked. "A young gentleman. Redeems and lodges again, near enough every quarter. Same pieces, sometimes, comes in easy, like a man paying a debt he means to settle." The clerk shut the ledger. "I've said more than I ought. You've said nothing that isn't the truth, and the truth is a public record under the Act." Alice took out the small stub of pencil she carried for marking hymns and the back of an old pattern paper. "The ticket numbers," she said. "And the dates." "I'll copy them here, in my own hand, and you'll not have given me a thing." He watched her do it. He might have stopped her. He did not. She copied the numbers slow and plain, the way she wrote a laundry list, and against each one she set the date it had come in, and she saw the pattern rise up off the paper as she wrote. A redemption a few days before Michaelmas, a lodging again a week after. The same dance at Lady Day, at Midsummer, every quarter. The plate went out, came home for the counting that never came, and went straight out again. She folded the pattern paper small. She thanked him for his trouble. She said she was sorry to have brought a difficulty to his counter, and she meant it, because he had a decent face, and she had used it. Outside the light had gone flat and grey over Chester. She had an hour before the coach. She spent it standing under the cathedral wall with the folded paper in her glove, not weeping, not shaking, only setting the thing in order in her mind the way she set a seam before she cut it. Twelfth Night. That was the frame. The season would close with the same guests it had opened. The Baroness would have her card evening and her cold pleasure, and 11 people who had heard count the spoons would be under one roof again. If she was to answer an accusation made before witnesses, she would answer it before the same witnesses. Nowhere else would do. She got on the coach. She went home to the bed over the stillroom. And she said nothing. That was the hardest part, and no one who has not done it will believe how hard. To hold a thing like that inside your chest and mend aprons over it. To carry the family's tea and stand while they laughed and know what you knew, and let no muscle of your face carry it out into the room. She mended at the long family table now some evenings, when the Baroness liked the company of a working woman to feel generous over. She sat with her needle and her husband's brass thimble on her finger and her eyes down, and Julian would come in smelling of horse and cold air and drop into a chair, and she would think, "I have your name folded in my box upstairs, and I will not lift my eyes." Once it nearly came apart. Pargeter had taken to leaving the search book on the shelf by the servant's door, as ordered, and one evening he took it up to carry it to the housekeeper's room, and a paper slipped in its spine, her copied list, tucked there, because she had thought the book the safest place, a shield inside a shield. He caught it between two fingers. He half drew it out. "What's this, then?" he said, not sharp, only a butler's tidiness. Alice was 3 steps off with a stack of clean linen. Her heart went over once, hard, but her hands did not stop folding. "A hem measure," she said, "for her ladyship's grey. I'll want it again. Leave it if you would." He looked at it. It was covered in numbers. And a butler sees numbers on a servant's paper and thinks of measures and marketing and thinks no further. He pushed it back into the spine. "See it doesn't fall out," he said, and set the book down, and went on. She stood a moment after he'd gone. Then she took the paper up and carried it to her own room and put it in the sewing box under the lining, beside the brass thimble, where a man's hands would not go. Relief came up her spine like warmth after cold water. She sat on the edge of the bed and let it pass through her, and then she was steady again. The list told more than a name when she gave her evenings to reading it. It was not a matter of this winter. She laid the dates end to end, and they ran back and back, 3 years of them, quarter on quarter. The same pieces going out and coming home. It had been going on while her husband was still living and mending clocks in Cheshire, and she had never heard of Aldercott. 3 years. The Baroness had lost silver by the tableful across 3 years, and had never once had it counted, because to count it was Pargeter's office, and Pargeter had not counted in 4. And it was not a stranger. That was the second stair. A house imagines a thief coming in over a wall in the dark. This thief came in over the deal at the card table and called for more coal. It was the son. The heir. The one man in the house whose word no one would ever weigh against a widow's. And it was not, in the end, about silver at all. She saw that when she set the sums against what the servants' hall knew and would not say. Julian owed money in Manchester, a great deal of it, near £900, the figure passed from a groom who'd heard it from the young man who came at the card evening. The plate was not being stolen to be kept. It was being pawned to feed a debt that ate faster than the estate could pay. Each quarter the silver went to Halloran's to hold off a worse creditor, and came home just long enough to look like it had never left. She told one person. She had to tell one, or she would not have carried it. She showed Susan Pell a single entry up in the cold passage where the girl was blacking a grate. Susan was 16 and had watched Alice's basket turned out on the kitchen flags and had said nothing then because she was frightened and had been ashamed of her silence ever since. Alice put the paper where the girl could read it and said only, "Do you know that hand? Do you know that name?" Susan read it. Her face did a slow thing. "Mr. Julian rides to Chester," she whispered. "Late, before the family reckons up at the quarter. I've let him out the side myself, past 10, and he comes back before light with the horse blown. I never thought," she stopped. "I thought it none of my business." "It's mine now," Alice said. "You've told me what your own eyes saw on your own account, and no one made you. Remember that you said it freely. It may matter that you were free." Susan nodded, white to the lips, and something changed in her that day. She stood a little straighter after. She had a thing she knew and had said, and it had not killed her. But Julian was not a fool, only a young man who had never once imagined anyone keeping a record against him. And a man like that, when he feels the air change, does not ask why. He acts. He had marked the sewing woman. He'd seen her too still at the table, her eyes too steady down. And with Twelfth Night coming, and the family reckoning that always haunted the edge of the season, he wanted the one witness gone whose hands were a matter of writing, the woman searched clean every night, whose very cleanness, if anyone ever thought about it, pointed the finger away from her and toward whoever was not searched. So he did the oldest thing. He accused her first. A christening cup had gone from the plate room, a small old thing, silver gilt, that had done for 3 generations of Wrenmore infants. It had gone, in truth, to Halloran's, redeemed and re-lodged with the rest. But Julian went to his mother and said he'd had it from Pargetter's own account that the cup was missing, and that the sewing woman had been seen too near the plate room passage, and that a house could not keep a servant under such a cloud through the family's own feast. The Baroness was ready to believe it. She had wanted a thief since the autumn. Here was her son, bringing her one gift wrapped. She sent word by Mrs. Dennett, cold-handed, that Alice Renshaw would be turned out before Twelfth Night, and that the search book, the book of her own nightly cleansing, would be taken up as evidence of the very theft, since a woman searched every night must be a woman with reason to fear a search. They turned her own shield into the knife. Alice heard it standing in the housekeeper's passage, with her hands folded in her apron, and for one breath the whole thing swung over her like a door coming loose. If they took the book, she had lost her witnesses. If they timed a redemption to put the cup back in the plate room on a night she was searched, they would find her clean and call it cunning, and turn her out into a February with £14 a year behind her and no family to write to. One night. She had one night, and the guests already coming up the drive for the feast, carriage lamps swinging in the dark. She did not deny the cup. That was the whole of it, and she saw it clear as a cut seam. To deny was to do again the thing that had failed her in the autumn, to answer an accusation made before witnesses with a mere word, which no accusation of that kind can ever be answered by. She had learned that lesson in a book of signed pages. You do not disprove such a thing by saying no. You outlast it with a record, and you spring the record when the witnesses are in the room. So she asked for one thing. She asked Mrs. Dennett to carry a request to her ladyship that before she was turned out, and to settle the matter of the cup honestly, the whole of the plate be brought up and laid out and counted, now tonight before the assembled guests, against Mr. Pargetter's inventory. If she was a thief, the count would show it, and she would go without a word. If refusing, she said only, let her ladyship consider how a refusal would look, with 11 guests at the table and a woman asking to be counted. She knew the Baroness could not refuse. A woman who has told a room to count the spoons cannot, before the same room, decline to count them. To refuse the count was to confess she feared it, and the Baroness feared nothing, because the Baroness was certain of her thief, certain of her son, certain that a widow with no standing had at last overreached. She consented, delighted, as she had consented to the searches. She thought she was granting Alice enough rope. They laid the plate out in the long dining hall on green baize. Under the candles, the 11 guests seated near enough, as they had sat on the card night, the Colonel who had repeated the spoon joke, the young man from Manchester, the rest. Julian stood by the fire with a glass. The Baroness sat at the head with her rings on. Pargetter came in with the inventory book he had not read against the shelves in 4 years, and did not know he was carrying his own undoing under his arm. The count began. Susan Pell called the pieces off the baize, and Pargetter answered them from his list, and Alice stood at the side, with her hands folded and her husband's thimble on her finger, and said nothing at all. At first, salvers, tureens, the great pern, the candlesticks in their pairs. And then the gaps began to show, the way they had shown to her on the shelves all through the autumn. One absence at a time. The large salver, Susan said. Chester marks. It's not here. Pargeter looked at his list. It should be here, he said. The casters, Susan said. Pepper, mustard and the rest. The set's not here. It should be here. The christening cup, Susan said, and her voice shook only a little. It's not here. The room had gone very quiet. The Baroness's face was still set in its certainty, but the certainty had begun to look for its thief and not to find her where it had put her, because the missing pieces were mounting past what one woman's basket could ever have carried out a servant's door. Now Alice spoke. She laid the search book open on the green baize. Among the silver, its pages turned to the autumn. 11 weeks of entries, every one in a witness's hand, nothing found, AR, clean, and a signature. Pargeter's own signature on the first line, and Mrs. Dennet's, and the dates running night after night down the columns. Every night this winter I was searched at the door as I left, she said level, to the room, and not to the Baroness. Searched to the skin some nights, and it is written here, and signed by the very people who searched me, that nothing was ever found. Here are the nights. Here are the names of those who cleared me. Then she laid beside the book the thin sheaf of copied tickets from Halloran's, flat on the baize, one against the next. And here, she said, are the dates the plate was pawned in Chester. Read them against my nights. The salver went out while I stood clean at this door. The casters went while I stood clean at this door. The cup that I am accused of taking went out to a Chester pawnshop, and was redeemed again on days that are written here in a pawnbroker's ledger under the Act, and on every one of those days there is a line in this book. Signed. That says Alice Renshaw was searched and had nothing. She touched the hallmarks she had copied. She read them aloud, plain, the way she counted stitches, the Chester assay mark, the lion passant, the date letter a lowercase italic h for 1849, the maker's mark RF. That was the firm that supplied this very house. The marks on the salver in Halloran's window, she said, are the marks on the salver that is missing from this table. It is the same silver. It did not walk to Chester in my basket. It was carried by a man on a horse, late, past 10, before every quarter's reckoning, and lodged in Chester under a name that is written on these tickets, which any of you may read. She did not say the name, she let the tickets say it. Pargeter reached them first, because his hands had gone to the papers by instinct, the instinct of a man who has kept accounts all his life and knows when accounts are wrong. He read down them. And the butler, who had not counted the plate in 4 years, set his own useless inventory down on the baize very slowly, and understood, all at once and all the way through, that the 2 locks and the 2 keys he had been so proud of had guarded nothing, because he himself had never opened the door to check. His face went from red to grey. He did not defend himself. There was no defence to make. He said only, in a voice gone small, I did not count. He said it again, quieter, 4 years. I did not count. And that was the whole of his confession, and it was enough. Julian moved next. He had been by the fire with his glass, and he came off the mantel and crossed to the table and took the tickets up, and Alice watched him do it and did not raise her voice or her hand. He read them. He saw the numbers he had signed for at Halloran's counter, his own redemptions, dated and witnessed by a clerk under the law, laid flat in a row on his mother's baize among his mother's silver, in front of his mother's guests. He looked for a way out of it the way a man looks for a door in a wall he knows to be solid. He owned this room. He owned this house, or would, and the room had turned itself against him, quietly, made of paper, and there was nothing in it he could shout at, because the woman who had done it was standing with her hands folded and her eyes down, and had not shouted at all. His mouth worked. Nothing came. He set the last ticket down because his hand would not hold it, and Alice reached across and laid it flat and square beside the others so it could be read, and that small motion, the straightening of a paper, was the whole of her revenge upon him. And it was worse than any word. And the Baroness Wrenmore, who had said, over the deal, with 11 people to hear her, count the spoons when she leaves, sat at the head of her table and was made to hear the spoons counted. She had looked all evening for the widow's anger, for tears, for a raised voice, for the ugly collapse of a servant caught out, which would have let her feel that she had been right to suspect, right to accuse, right in every cold thing she had done since the autumn. She found none of it. She found a book of her own household signatures clearing the woman she had ruined, night after signed night. She found her son's name on a pawnbroker's tickets. She found the loss she had half suspected all along and would not investigate, because to investigate was to risk finding it in her own blood, and she had rather it lived in a sewing woman's basket. Into that silence the young man from Manchester, the one who had come at the card evening, who had heard the joke made and had laughed at it with the rest, said, not loudly, but into a room quiet enough to carry it, count the spoons. He said it looking at the Baroness. He said it the way you hand a thing back to the person who dropped it, and the Colonel, who had repeated it all winter as a parlour game, looked at his own hands, and did not repeat it now. Alice let the room sit in that. Then she said the only thing she had allowed herself, and she said it level, without heat, because heat would have spoiled it. You told them to count the spoons when I left. She looked at the Baroness once, and only once. I only asked that we count them while everyone who heard you is still in the room. No one answered her. There was no answer to make. The plate lay short on the baize, the book lay open and signed, the tickets lay flat and dated. And the truth of the house was on the table where anyone could count it, and it counted the same for everyone. The Baroness did not turn her out. She could not. The evening had made that plain past arguing, when the guests had gone and the candles were guttering, and Julian had left the room without being able to look at his mother. The thing that remained was a house that had run for 4 years on suspicion and never once on account, and a single person in it whose honesty was not a matter of anyone's opinion, but a matter of writing, signed and witnessed and dated, night after night through a whole hard winter. You cannot govern a house by suspicion. Once suspicion has been shown up before 11 guests, you govern it by inventory. And the inventory wanted a keeper whose hands the house could trust, and there was exactly one such pair of hands in the building, and they belonged to the woman they had searched at the door. The plate-room keys hung on a plain ring, 2 of them. Pargetter's and the Baroness's own, the 2 locks that had guarded nothing. In the quiet after the feast the Baroness had them fetched, and she did not make a speech of it, because she had no speech left. She set the ring down on the green baize among the emptied places where the silver had been, and she pushed it an inch toward Alice with one finger, the way you concede a hand you have lost. Alice took them up. She put them in her pocket, and felt their small weight settle there, and said, "Thank you, my lady," in exactly the voice she had used to say it all winter, no more and no less, because she was housekeeper now, and a housekeeper does not gloat any more than a sewing woman weeps. That was Twelfth Night. The rest is quick to tell, the way the ends of things are. A year on, the plate-room at Aldercott is counted every quarter, in the open, against a fresh inventory, with the under-housekeeper reading the pieces off, and the housekeeper answering from the list, for Susan Pell is under-housekeeper now, learning the lists, standing straight. A girl who found out at 16 that saying a true thing freely does not kill you. The 2 keys hang on their ring in a housekeeper's pocket and go into the 2 locks 4 times a year, and the silver is all present, because it is looked at, and a thing that is looked at does not walk to Chester in the night. The search book is retired. It sits folded away in the bottom drawer of the housekeeper's desk. Its work done. 11 weeks of a widow's humiliation turned to 11 weeks of a widow's proof, and it is not opened now except once or twice when Alice has wanted, on a low evening, to remember what a signed page is worth. Mr. Pargeter was pensioned off, quietly, without disgrace, spoken aloud, because the family wanted no more of the matter said than had already been said before their guests. He went to a sister's cottage. He had admitted, before witnesses, that he did not count for 4 years, and a butler who says that of himself has said all that needs saying. The Honourable Julian Wrenmore was sent north to a cousin's counting-house to sit at a desk and learn what a column of figures is for, among people who count everything and forgive nothing, which is perhaps the one schooling that might do him good. He does not come to the card evenings now. There is no silver left loose for him to carry, and no one to carry it past. And the Baroness's card evenings grow thinner every season. Fewer carriages up the drive each 12th night. It is a curious thing, how a story travels, how 11 people who heard a joke made will carry ever after the memory of the joke handed back. She sits at her table with a smaller company each year, and somewhere in the house, 4 times a year, a plain ring of 2 keys goes into 2 locks, and the silver is all there. Alice Renshaw has a room now with a window. On the sill of it stands her husband's brass thimble, worn thin on one side, her initials scratched in the base of it by a clockmaker's hand a long time ago, her one kept thing, kept still. Some evenings she sits by that window with her mending, because a housekeeper still mends, and she looks out at the Cheshire dark, and she thinks how near she came to being turned out into it with nothing, and how the thing that saved her was not cleverness and not anger, and not one loud word spoken in her own defence. It was a book. It was a set of signatures. It was a woman who understood that an accusation made in front of witnesses can never be answered by saying no, that you cannot argue it away, you can only outlast it with a record, kept plainly, dated honestly, and sprung at last in front of the very people who first believed the lie. Quiet people read the fine print. They keep the receipts, and when the day comes that someone points a finger, they do not shout. They open a drawer. If a story like that has ever happened to you, if you were ever accused of a thing and made to answer it not with noise, but with proof, tell me the city you're watching from. And stay a moment, there are more of these where this came from.